ana te whānau. So we've got 6, 7, 8, 9. Everyone's been waiting patiently. Kia ora koutou, nau mai haere mai. We're just going to spend a minute or two allowing people to come through. Quite a lot of attendees today, so we need to give the space for everyone to make their way in. I'm sure everyone's been waiting patiently. Kia ora tātou. Just while everyone's making their way in, whānau, if you guys haven't already been on the Zoom webinar before, the chat box down the bottom is the way that you can communicate. Ko te here, what we're looking to do just to kick things off before Te Miri actually jumps into his kōrero is if everyone can sort of type in the chat box whereabouts they're tuning in from. So yeah, kei te here rohe koutou e noho ana. And the type of mahi and or interest that have brought you to this webinar. So if everyone can sort of start having a bit of a chat away in the chat group, that'll give us a bit of a gauge around some of the kaupapa that can tautoko the kōrero tēnei rā. Alright. Engari, I runga i tēnā tātou mā, we'll crack in. We're wanting to make sure that our kai kōrero has as much time as he can to get through his kōrero. No reira whānau mā, ka tīmata tēnei wahanga i tētai paku karakia, ka tai ka haere ki ngā whakahaerenga, no reira me noi tātou. Tīkina tūrā te pūtake o ngā kōrero o te wānanga, tīkina tūrā te hautapu a ngā riki, kauwhata te tāne te wānanga ki runga ki enei kaimahi, ki enei whānau, ki enei pia, kia koi te matapunenga, kia maiangi te matapu iho iho, tūturu whakamaua kia tīna, tīna, haumi e, hui e, tai ki e. Kapua, kia ora tātou. Nau mai haere mai ki tēnei wānanga Toi Ako, ki runga i te ao hiko me ki, runga te ipurangi, nāku te honore te tū hei kai kōrero mō toi tangata i tēnei rā, te arahi i tēnei nā Toi Ako me ki. So welcome everybody to our Toi Ako Webinar series. We're very fortunate to have Te Miri rangi i tēnei rā. Tēnā koe te tuakana, e mihi atu ana kia koe, mo tō whai wā ki te wānanga tahi, me te ope maha me ki, puta noa atu I Aotearoa. So if you haven't been on one of our webinars before, it looks like everyone's figured it out. So the Q&A section down the bottom is where you'll ask your pātai. In the chat box is where a lot of additional kōrero can happen throughout the webinar as well. And whānau, our tikanga today is we're going to leave the pātai for the end. So it's fine for you to ask the pātai. Reason being is you may get the answer to that pātai before the kōrero is completed. So what we're looking to do today is we're going to leave the pātai for that last sort of 10-15 minute area so that we can let Te Miri share a bit more around his kaupapa i tēnei rā. No reira, mehe pātai a koutou, just come through in the chat box and we'll look into those later. I'll theme them up as we're going through our kōrero. If I feel like those pātai have been answered, we will look to put those ones aside and put some of the other ones forward. So whānau, we had about 223 registrations for this. So if we let everyone ask a pātai, we're going to be here till tomorrow. So we'll look at some ways to be able to communicate with Te Miri post wānanga as well. So kei a koe te wā e te tuakana, ka karawhiua ki a koe.
Tēnā koe Dario, tutai me mihi katika ki a koe nā au I tuku tō tātou karakia, hei whakawātea, hei huakina mai tēnei o ngā ata. Me mihi katika hoki ke rātou mā ko wheturangi hia, ngā tini aitua, rātou ko hinga haere o ki atu rā. Tahuri mai ai te whakaaro ki tātou te hunga ora. Tātou kua hui ko karapine nei ki tēnei pai kōrero, tēnā koutou, huri no tēnā tātou katoa. E tuku hoki ngā mihi kia koe tā me tō kāhui ki toi tangata, e whakahaere I tēnei kaupapa, e whakamana nei I enei āhuatanga o mātou matua tupuna. Kia koe me te kāhui o toi tangata e mihi ana. Huri no kia koutou katoa, ko tā mai tēnei ata, kia ora koutou. Ko e tēnei e uri au o Ngāti Tūwharetoa, ko tonga riro te maunga, taku maunga tūturu, ko tauponui a tia te moana, ko te heu te tangata, ngā te tūwharetua te iwi. He hononga anō oku ki te aroa waka, ki a Maniapoto Ngāti Raukawa. Ko Mōkai, ko Hia Kaitupeka, Waititoko ngā marae, ko Te Miri rangi i taku ingoa. E noho nei au ki roto o Porirua i nei wā, he kaimahi mō ACC, no rea tēnā koutou katoa. My name's Te Miri rangi, I live in Porirua, currently work developing kaupapa Māori approaches to injury prevention at ACC. Most of my background, or my professional background, has been around Māori health, physical activity, recreation, play, sport, taumatakaro in that area, and then in both private iwi organisations and more recently in the public sector, and that's where I'm at the moment. I've always been really interested in physical activity. I studied a Bachelor of Arts and Bachelor of Physical Education at Otago, and I was really actually interested at how those two schools were really different. Different in the way they see the world, different in the methodology they teach. And so I was always wondering how I learned about mautaiaha, mauraka, me era momo in my Māori arts degree, and then you learn about exercise physiology, anatomy in my PE degree. But there was a real clear disconnect between those two perspectives. And I guess that kind of led to my my master's topic, which is around understanding a better understanding for myself really about how mātauranga Māori, how our beliefs and values as Māori define physical activity. And so that's I guess the gist of the kōrero for today. So I really want to thank everyone for making the time to join me in this kōrero this morning. I wanted to start with this omo karakia. Taku uaua ko te rangi e tūnei, taku uaua ko papa e takoto nei, whirikaha torokaha te uaua, haumi e hui e tāiki. Why I really like this karakia is it really sets the theme or the frame for this whole kōrero today. It talks about the spiritual connection to rangi nui papa tuānuku. It highlights the relationship that our tupuna shared with the natural environment. And it kind of identifies how our tupuna likened our own physical abilities to nature or to the powers of Atua. So that'll be a lot of the kōrero today, and so I really wanted to kind of set that as the tuāpapa, I suppose, for the kōrero for today. And so this is, I guess, the opportunity for me to share the research and findings of my master's, which is about understanding a kaupapa Māori approach to physical activity. And there's kind of three questions that I'll go through this morning about, what is traditional Māori physical activity? How does our mātauranga and our Māori beliefs and values inform practices of physical activity as Māori? And whether or not they're still relevant I tēnei ao huri. And so as I mentioned, this is like a research project for me. And I really wanted to concentrate today on the research findings and the results as opposed to the methodology. But just so that we're all aware, it's a kaupapa Māori research project. And so what that means is it's underpinned by a kaupapa Māori paradigm, that it's guided by Māori health research ethics and the way in which I conduct myself as a Māori researcher. And then the other interesting point is that I developed my own methodology, a whakapapa-based methodology, which essentially is about understanding the relationships between ourselves and the world around us. Our relationship with concepts, with ideas, with practices, and how they interact with each other. And I guess that's the basis of a Māori perspective on of the world. There is some sources of mātauranga that I've used through some of this kōrero, pūrakau, momo waiata, mō tiatia, whakataukī, and wānanga kōrero with a few I guess leaders in what is sport, recreation, physical activity. So you've got likes of those who are experts in Māori health, real mātauranga in traditional Māori games, others who have a the practice of applying mātauranga Māori in the relationship with nature. So things like maramataka is a form of that. And also those who have kind of tried to apply a contemporary lens to mātauranga in the application of physical activity approaches for Māori. And so I've used kōrero with them to help shape some of this kōrero. And you might be wondering why there's a fire for the pūrakau. That was the only symbol I could find that made me think about where we shared pūrakau around the fire, sharing kōrero tawhito with each other. So I thought that was a good symbol for that one. So we'll get straight into it. What is traditional Māori physical activity? There are kind of 4 themes that emerged from answering this pātai, and I'll go through each of those at the moment. But just briefly, they're about, he Māori te noho, that traditional Māori society was a time where Māori beliefs and values and practices were dominant. He Māori te āhua, the way in which traditional physical activity was part of a holistic system of well-being. And he Māori te taiao, about our really close relationship with nature. And he Māori i tāmi, which is about how our perspectives have been marginalised and oppressed over time. And so I'm going to share a little bit of the kōrero that was shared with me, and you'll see a few comments that come up. I'll try not to read all of them in the essence of saving time. But this first theme, he Māori te noho, is really about understanding the characteristics of traditional Māori society. In order to really understand traditional Māori physical activity, we have to know the world in which our tupuna lived and how they thought about the world. So this theme talks about understanding or defining pre-colonial traditional Māori society in Aotearoa. It was a time where Māori beliefs, values and practices were dominant, and it was like a unique understanding, it led to a unique understanding of physical activity. The characteristics of traditional Māori society that I discovered were things like Māori autonomy, that Māori had control over their lives. They had their own common understanding of what was right and what was wrong. And that was the way of the whenua. That was the tikanga of the time. The second part was traditional Māori physical activity. Traditional Māori society was inherently active. Transport, collecting kai, all of our activities through just by living required a certain level of physical activity. So it was built into the way of life. And a third part was about this idea of whānau, about collective participation and collective outcomes. So everything that our tupuna did in ngā rā mua was really about growing the collective outcome for all of our whānau hapua niwi, as opposed to a real individual self-centered approach. Another element of traditional physical activity was about mātauranga Māori. So our knowledge system and the way in which we transmitted information between generations was really underpinned by mātauranga, and we developed ways to be able to share that mātauranga. Ori ori, karakia, waiata, mahitoi, all of these different cultural products and tools that help us pass on information across generations. And then the last one is really about a really deep, and this was a strong theme that came, or a strong characteristic, was about our spirituality. And it wasn't as if we talked about Atua as something distant, but that we inherently believed in the construct of Atua and the idea of Atua as our tupuna. And that had a significant bearing on the way we saw the world and the things that we did. And I'll share a little bit more about that as we go on. So that this theme was really about understanding traditional Māori society, about Māori having control over their lives, that physical activity was embedded in all parts of life, about the collective approach to living, that mātauranga helped to maintain well-being practices, and that we had an inherent spiritual belief. So all of those things help shape how we might define traditional Māori physical activity. The second theme was about he Māori te āhua and a holistic system of well-being. We might be familiar with various Māori health models, te whare tapawhā, te Atua Matua framework, te whike, auamomo models, I suppose, that describe an inherent holistic approach to understanding the world. And so as a result, physical activity can't be considered in isolation, but has to be considered within the context of a holistic system of well-being. And so what that means is, we have different ways of understanding the relationships between Māori physical activity and other elements of our lives. And the way that we developed and constructed those meanings through mātauranga, through taonga tākaro. And then, I guess another part of this was that holistic system of well-being was embedded into all parts of our society. Right through from traditional Māori games, as tamariki teaches people the skills and the knowledge to be able to understand how to thrive within a community and how to survive. And so there's the framing that I heard from one of the interviewees was about this preventative process to ensure that our tupuna could protect whakapapa and ensure that it would be passed on to the next generation. So the holistic system of well-being was a real inherent part of traditional physical activity for Māori. The third theme is about he Māori te taio. I use a lowercase m in this to kind of make the point that the word Māori means to be normal, to be natural. And it kind of fits the logic that I was trying to keep with all my themes. But he Māori te taio really talks about how closely connected our tupuna were to nature. There was a really deep intrinsic relationship with our physical and natural world. There were so many comments about this in varying ways. The things that talked about our connection to Atua, that spiritual underpinning of our understanding of Atua Māori really guided our interactions and our understanding of places. So there were instances where, we talked about if you were to engage in tangaroa or in the ocean, then you really had to understand the characteristics of tangaroa. Similarly, if you were to engage in the forest, you had to understand the characteristics of tāne mahuta and engage, and that mana and that mauri and that tapu from that Atua guided our engagement in those places. And so mātauranga was a means to be able to facilitate that learning and understanding. Here was a good example. Ia koe whakatoa nei te pūrapura, excuse the typo, kōrero koe te mana o rongo. So when you, one of the participants was talking about how when you were working in the garden, when our tupuna worked in the garden, they were guided by the mana of rongo matane for being Atua of our cultivated crops. And so that meant that you didn't just throw seeds around or throw your kai around in that area, but that there was a level of care, a level of respect afforded to the activity. So the tikanga involved with that particular type of physical activity is informed by the mātauranga of that Atua. And so you take that same concept to other areas. If you were catching birds in the ngahere, then that practice, that tikanga, was informed by the mātauranga of tāne mahuta in that area. And the last bit here was about, because of that strong connection to nature, our perspective of time was significantly different than it is today. And physical activity as a result was influenced by our seasons, the rising and setting of stars, the cycles of the moon, and our natural indicators that told us what was the best time to be physically active. A good example of that, I heard Rangi Mātāmua talk about how, I think it's kārehu, one of the stars in the sky, as it rises in the morning, it signifies the time where you start prepping your garden. And I think the shape of that whetū looks like a shovel or a core to help turn your garden over. So we made these stories, we created these pūrakau, these kōrero that help to transmit our relationship with nature into our practice of physical activity. Then the last theme was, it was really challenging to talk about traditional Māori physical activity without the context of our historical experience and the ongoing impacts of colonisation. And there were two elements to this. One was about, the experience and ongoing experience of colonisation and how we don't follow that type of practice today. but also the need to re-indigenize and rethink about how we, or to reclaim some of our mātauranga that has been marginalised and oppressed over time. And I'll talk a little bit more about this as we go through the kōrero. So those were the four themes really that came through about understanding what is traditional Māori physical activity. In essence, it was that Māori had tino rangatiratanga, they were self-determining, had mana motu haki over their lives, that it was underpinned by mātauranga and Māori values, and that there was a level of moiruatanga or spirituality that connected the physical practice with a spiritual experience. The third bit that I probably, the fourth bit, sorry, that I'd add is about that innate relationship with nature, which begs the question about how does modern indoor approaches to physical activity facilitate Māori approaches to physical activity? And there'll be a question I might answer a little later. Kabai, so the next pata is about how diving a bit more deeper into how does mātauranga inform our Māori beliefs, values and practices as Māori. So the first bit is about mātauranga. What is mātauranga? It's developed over multiple generations, underpins a Māori worldview and understanding of the universe that's consistent with a holistic whakapapa informed system of knowledge. Mātauranga helps shape Māori understanding of physical activity as something that's connected to all parts of life. And the description I really liked about mātauranga is that it's a continual process of knowledge creation. So it reflects on the past, it reinterprets in the present, and it's passed on for the future. And it doesn't stay constant, it doesn't stay stagnant. As an example, our tupuna who sailed here, mai Hawaii, they encountered new flora and fauna that they hadn't seen before, created new mātauranga to help make sense of what they were seeing, and then the tikanga, or the application of how to engage with those things, was developed over time. And that might be considered, a scientific approach to knowledge creation. So mātauranga was about this continual process of knowledge creation, which I quite liked. But it also talks about this close connection to whakapapa. And I describe whakapapa as the organising system for mātauranga. So what I mean by that is you have mātauranga over various atua of different environments that then has connections to other environments. So when pohutukawa flowers, or the kōwhai flowers, it was a tohu that our kina and the moana were whak. And so that's about the relationship between atua and the connections between mātauranga through whakapapa relationships. And so then that brings up atua is the third part in this story, about how mātauranga is the knowledge, whakapapa is how it's organised as Māori, and then atua is the way that we express that as narrative forms. So understanding, what are the Māori, how does mātauranga inform the beliefs, values and practice of physical activity, is really returning back to this framework about mātauranga influenced, organised by whakapapa and expressed through atua. So, another example of how we shared those kōrero were through pūrakau. Stories about Maui, stories about hine moana, about mahuika, about our stories of our atua and deities, or our tupuna with continual influence over us. And so these things were really integral to our understanding of mātauranga and whakapapa of atua. And these were expressed through heaps of different forms as well. It wasn't just pūrakau, like I mentioned earlier about mōtia, te haka, waiata, mahi toi. But these were developed and shared within Whanau. And so within this is thinking about where whānau hapu e niwi sit in the context of creating new mātauranga and sharing mātauranga. So as a pipi who's born into the world, it is the immediate whānau who helps them come to understand this mātauranga and this relationship with the world. And a real other interesting whakaaro I wanted to share too was about how te reo Māori carries meaning and understanding about our relationship between Kori Tinana and Atua. So there is He Pata Ka Kupu is a really great online internet dictionary, Māori dictionary, that gives descriptions of Māori kupu in Te Reo Māori. And the benefit of doing so is that there are real challenges with cross-language interpretations of not only words but concepts. So he pātaka kupu was a real good source to think about, how do we describe mātauranga in Te Reo Māori, or how do we describe whakapapa in Te Reo Māori? And so I dived into a little bit around understanding what were our kupu Māori that described physical activity to help understand some of that mātauranga. And one example was Kori Tinana. And so the first word kori talks about, to move, to wriggle, to play. Kori was really interesting. In he pātaka kupu, they share a whakapapa of each kupu to an atua. So each kupu has an atua that it has a whakapapa relationship with. And through that, we get a deeper understanding of the kupu. So for example, Kori shared whakapapa to Ruaumoko, Ruaumoko being the atua of or the youngest of the children of Rangi and Papa Tuanuku, who is said to reside with Papa Tuanuku. And Te Huri Hanganui, when Papa Tuanuku was face downwards, that Ruaumoko was encapsulated, I suppose, with his mother, Papa Tuanuku, and it's his small movements that creates earthquakes, tremors, and the flow of lava to some. So kori in that instance, when it's about that small movement, was connected to Ruaumoko. But the really interesting thing for me in this was that when you talk about kori in relation to the human body, then the whakapapa of that kupu stems to tāne mahuta in this text. And my interpretation of that is about the relationship between tāne mahuta and the creation of Hine Ahuone, and Hine Ahuone being the first human-born person in the world, I suppose. So when you use kori in the context of describing our human body, then that whakapapa connects to tāne mahuta. And then the last one, kori, was about a connection to tū mātauranga. And this example was more about movement or kori that was related to whai kōrero. Movement of our kai kōrero on the pai was related to tū mātauranga. And if you're familiar with pōwhiri as a traditional engagement process for Māori, there were elements of that process that were guided by the mana and mauri and tapu of tū mātauranga. So knowing that you weren't really sure who was at your pā, whether they were friends or foe, tū mātauranga was about protecting whānau. And so in that whai kōrero space, when you're engaging with an unknown visitor, it makes sense that our tupuna were guided by manaki and guided by an aspect to tiaki themselves. So Kori Tinana as a kai kōrero was connected to tū mātauranga, which I thought was really interesting. When you think about those places in which you use a word like kori, that there's different atua, different connections to different atua depending on the context in which that kupu is used. And so taking then that framework about the mātauranga of atua means that there's different interpretations of that word kori depending on the way that you use it. Why that's important is if we think about physical activity as defined by a European Western biomedical definition of physical activity is any bodily movement that is performed by your muscle, your skeletal muscle, that results in energy expenditure. It's a real exercise physiology 101 type of definition, but that definition is constant no matter the context. And that adds to its strength in some cases, but for Māori, our definitions and our meanings derive different whakapapa and therefore derive different mātauranga, and as a result there's different tikanga applied to it. So tinana is the same, but tinana was connected to the meaning as the body or torso or the main part of anything. And in that sense, when you're talking about a body of water, then or a body of a tree, then it's connected to rangi and papa. But when you were talking about the body of the person, it was again connected to tāne mahuta. So I guess that what I'm trying to get across here is that our defining Māori concepts and defining traditional Māori physical activity has to be cognizant of our different atua, the whakapapa they share in the mātauranga that's attached to that. I hope you're all still following me. It's a bit hard trying to do these kōrero and you can't see people's faces.
Ke kone tonu, bro. Ke kone tonu te minenga.
So that was about mātauranga. This slide was really about how mātauranga informs our values. So values are traditional Māori values are important because they determine, beliefs of Māori towards physical activity. They set the standards of behaviour, of what's right and wrong. They're socially constructed within a community, which means that they evolve over time. And these were some of the values that came out in the kōrero with the interviewees, participants in this, but also diving into some of those pūrakau and kōrero tuku. Kaitiakitanga, about our role to maintain the mana of our environments. Again, speaking to the close relationship we had with nature, about whanaungatanga, our kinship relationships, because we lived as hapu, as whānau in our pā at that time. And so whanaungatanga was about how we mediated relationships, familial relationships. Manaakitanga was about respect and hospitality, and how we uplift, or how we aki the mana of tangata, how we uplift the mana of others. In rangatiratanga, about leadership, chieftainship, authority. And so these are the ways in which we guided our behaviour. So as an example, if you were going to kohi kaimoana for your whānau, there was an act of manaakitanga, but also about whanaungatanga, because you might have the obligation to whānau to go out there and kohi kaimoana. And so these values are significantly important because it tells us as Māori what is important and what is right and what's wrong. And I'll talk a little bit more about what that means for today a little later, but I guess it's important to acknowledge that we had values as Māori that guided our behaviour, and that was underpinned again by mātauranga. And so traditional Māori values inform the desirable behaviours of a society, and consequently that informs the way that we understand physical activity, or Māori physical activity. So the last bit is, are Māori beliefs and values and practices still relevant today? The short answer is absolutely, but it's a little bit more complex than that. And so what I wanted to share as part of the research was, there's a whakapapa to this question. There's a whakapapa to the experience that we have today and what we witness today as Māori, particularly the diverse lived realities of whānau, those who I consider ahi tere tere, who are a little bit disconnected, who come and go from their ahika, those who are ahika, who stay home and are really living in their own tūranga waiwai, who understand their reo and their tikanga and are bastions for their whānau. You have the ahi mātau, those who aren't connected to that place at all, and anu mātau. Anu mātau being a cold wind, they haven't experienced the spark. So these are our whānau who have Māori whakapapa but haven't shy away from that identity. So that has to shape our context about how we understand Māori beliefs and values and practices, and whether they're still relevant. And so why is that the case? If we take physical activity, and it's similar to other aspects of modern society as Māori, is that we've been impacted over time by our treaty partners. I say that nicely, but I probably kōrero anō tira. I just wanted to share this kōrero about, what is our experience of physical activity in Aotearoa over time. And I've talked a little bit about, traditional Māori society, which is pre-European context, talking like 1600s, ngā rā o mua, Māori autonomy, connection to nature, mātauranga Māori, a common understanding across whānau about what is right and wrong, working together as a whānau. This one's 1839, I think. So we've had a Pākehā influence in that time, leading to the signing of Te Tiriti o Waitangi to protect our mana motuhake and rangatiratanga. And while this is all happening, our understanding of what is right or wrong, our beliefs, our mātauranga is being compromised. We have the influence of modern sports, So we have cricket, curling, settler sports that were introduced to Aotearoa, and Māori took to them really strongly. As an example, the New Zealand Natives team, rugby team, they were the first New Zealand team to tour overseas. Many of them were Māori. And so it told us about how we engaged in not only Māori physical activity, but also modern approaches or non-Māori approaches to physical activity as well. Sharing was another massive influence on our whānau as well. Māori All Blacks, Māori Rugby, the establishment of Māori Rugby in 1910. You have other organisations that begin to establish as well. So Māori developing their own institutions, New Zealand Māori Golf, established 1932. We have, so what we're seeing here over time is that Māori start to create new forms of physical activity underpinned by their perspective, but our ability to apply our own Māori values to non-Māori physical activity. But there is experiences too that we had at this through this journey that have compromised our understanding of mātauranga. World War I, World War II, we lost a lot of our whānau who held that mātauranga and that understanding. But it also shaped some of our identity as Māori in terms of physical activity. Brendan Hokowhitu talks about Māori masculinity and the way that we frame our own identity through a colonised lens. So what we mean by that is that we start to accept that we are naturally physical, that we're naturally violent, and that men were only useful for the physical pursuits. And those are non-Māori descriptions of ourselves, they're colonised constructs that we have accepted as being tika, or as being authentic to our identity as Māori. So that leads to, Māori development movements in Aotearoa around social movements, the Māori Land March here, 1975, about, our mana motuhake here in Aotearoa and our rangatiratanga to be able to determine how we see the world as Māori. And so understanding physical activity is a part of all of this. We have government, central government establishing organisations tasked with the role of developing physical activity, recreation, sport in New Zealand. The Hillary Commission established 1987 Recreation and Sport Act, having the mandate, I suppose, to develop Aotearoa's perspective on physical activity. Void of a Māori perspective, I would strongly say as well. Through this time we have Māori trying to establish their own ways to engage in physical activity. Pa wars, inter-marae sports. Shout out to Te Papa Tākoro Aotearoa for the Tarawa Games that I've been involved with, and other iwi who are leading in that space as well. We also had, Hioranga Pautama through the Hillary Commission, or Spark at that time, who developed Māori approaches to physical activity in the public sector. So that was quite a shift, I suppose, about Māori influence in central government and influencing policy and approaches, or defining how we see the world and how we see physical activity. Iron Māori, another positive example of an expression of applying mātauranga to a modern form of physical activity. The establishment of Sport New Zealand. Dario, some of the work that you're doing at Toi Tangata around Hepi Kariri, again, another application of physical literacy approach informed by mātauranga Māori and Māori values. And then modern approaches, things like Māori movement, who again take that mātauranga from the past and applying it in a modern context. And then more recently, things like Tapu Waikura, Healthy Active Learning works through Ministry of Health, Sport New Zealand, Ministry of Education, which is about testing Māori approaches through Atua Matua framework that Dr. Hirangi Heke has shared as well. So you see this big movement of our understanding of physical activity from that period in a pre-European state where we had our mātauranga commonly understood, right through to today, where I've had it described to me as like a korowai that's missing pieces out of it. We know that it's a korowai, but there are big chunks missing. So we know that There are descriptions of physical activity, and our understanding, our mātauranga understanding of physical activity is not commonly understood. And so we're trying to rebuild and reinterpret and create new mātauranga or interpretations of mātauranga to help us understand how we navigate and make sense of physical activity i ēnei rā. And so, given the ongoing experience of colonisation for Māori, modern Māori physical activity is not only underpinned by mātauranga Māori and Māori cultural values, but also has to be underpinned by Māori development principles or kaupapa Māori principles that acknowledges the colonial experience. So they have to also acknowledge that not all of our whānau understand mātauranga, not all of our whānau understand Māori values, and so we have to be able to bring them along on the journey to understand themselves and understand their Māori identity. That's all a part of what Māori physical activity needs to look like in the future. It needs to create spaces for rich, authentic, mātauranga Māori informed approaches to physical activity, but it also needs to create spaces for our whānau who don't feel safe in those places to be Māori, and share that with others so that they develop their own sense of identity, their own sense of belonging, and their connection to their own identity, so that they can progress in their journey as a whānau towards oranga. So physical activity is not a passive agent in Aotearoa. Rather, it's been described as a colonial tool to continue to subjugate Māori. So what that means is that physical activity today, in our approaches to physical activity, particularly centrally here, is really informed by a biomedical perspective of physical activity. And that has guided largely our approach to physical activity development in Aotearoa. Physical activity guidelines are void of mātauranga Māori. They don't understand our connection to nature and could do better in strengthening our understanding of mātauranga Māori in terms of Kori Tinana physical activity. So if we are thinking about, how does it apply to physical activity i ēnei rā? I think through this journey, this study has really set out for me exploring the traditional beliefs of Māori, going back and trying to re-understand for myself what does mātauranga look like, and how do we define traditional Māori activity, and how do I decolonise my own thinking about what is Māori, and how do I authenticate what is Māori. And that's a challenging process as an individual, and I'm still on that haerenga at the moment, and by no means am I an expert at all. I've definitely found have pockets, significant pockets in my korowai that I still need to fill. But it provides insights into the mechanisms that help us define Māori physical activity, and highlights the role I think that traditional Māori beliefs and values have in addressing our health issues, obesity, increasing physical inactivity rates for Māori. But also the pounamu, the treasure in all of this, I think, is that traditional Māori physical activity is unique in the world because of our understanding of mātauranga. Māori have, it's unique because it requires Māori to have tino rangatiratanga i mana motuhake over their own lives, that it's underpinned by mātauranga Māori values, that it has that connection to wairuatanga and the spirituality that we have as Māori. And so if I was trying to define what traditional Māori physical activity is, dynamic, it draws various meanings depending on the whakapapa and the mātauranga involved. But fundamentally, mātauranga is the paramount theory that underpins a Māori belief and understanding of Māori physical activity. It's an ongoing process of knowledge creation that I talked about earlier. And then from that view, physical activity for Māori is about understanding our connection to nature and facilitating our understanding of ourselves. There's a couple of last thoughts I wanted to share. That Māori values are informed by mātauranga and set the agreed standards of behaviours of what's important for Māori. Being that they're socially constructed, that we as Māori have responsibilities, particularly in our own marae, in our own whare, to determine how do we understand our own values as Māori, and how do we determine what is right and wrong. And my humble opinion is that oranga has to be the ultimate outcome. It has to be about preserving our own whakapapa and our own mana and integrity and passing that on to our tamariki mokopuna. That's what I try and do with my pipi. She's 2 next week, and sharing with her our pūrakau and our kōrero to help set some of her common understanding of mātauranga, for her to have practiced understanding of her values, our shared values as a whānau, so that can then be expressed and understood by her when she engages in a modern world, whether it's physical activity, education, health, kia harana. So just returning back to that karakia, ko taku ua korangi e tū nei, ko taku ua ko papa e takoto nei, whirikaha torokaha, te ua haumi e hui e taiki e. My sinew is like the sky above, my sinew is like the earth below, let my sinews gather strength and exert strength. Haumi e hui e taiki e. Physical activity is fundamentally about how we understand our relationship to our atua. So if I've shared anything with you today, if you're doing work around physical activity, sharing with Māori, have a think about how atua has a role in that mahi. Nō reira, I runga anō I tērā kauhau roa me aua kōrero, tēnā koutou, huri noa, tēnā rā koutou katoa.
Paki ana e tahi roto te tari bro. Mihi ana kia koe hoa. Te nuinga, kua tōna mai e tahi pātai. So we'll crack straight into the pātai before we go into a bit of a wrap up. So koutou mā, Te Miri is free to sit around a little bit longer. So if you do need to leave, we'll still have a few pātai that we can get through. E tahi o ngā pātai ko pita, bro. Some of them are pretty straightforward and some are, ahua nui ake. Tētahi ko pātai mai, they're interested in hearing how you can apply this into your mahi, or if you have, as in your role at ACC.
Yes, yeah. There's probably 4 principles from this that I'll take into things like central government or even other public spaces. The first one's our mana motuhake. So that Māori need to define and decide what it is that is right for Māori. That means they need to have the power and control to be able to determine what they see as important to them. And that's a fundamental right for Māori through Te Tiriti o Waitangi. So understanding that if we're, how do we apply these learnings in this sense, it's for me about advocating for Māori decision making and Māori power to decide what's right in terms of the mahi, whether it's physical activity or whatever. So mana motuhake, tino rangatiratanga. The second one is about mātauranga Māori. So ensuring that mātauranga Māori has an equal and respected and valued place in the setting, whether it's a school setting, an organisation or ACC. Often we revert back to Western paradigms and non-Māori forms of research to validate what is tika and what is right. But we have our own mātauranga that determines what's right for us as Māori. And so at a structural level, it's about making sure that we can create the space for mātauranga to determine what is right. And we measure success by that for Māori. The third one would be about mana motuake, tino rangatiratanga, mātauranga Māori, Maori ora. Maori ora is about well-being. So there has to be an outcome bigger than just the physical activity itself. It has to be about a holistic perspective of well-being. So that needs to contribute to our social relationships, our physical well-being, our mental well-being, our emotional well-being, all of those tahas and all of those kāwai o te wheke and all of those atua has to be considered in the context of a holistic approach. So those are probably the main things that I would apply. Mātauranga Māori and mana motuake are probably the two big ones.
Kapai. I guess this leads pretty well into what the next part is. It's around the modern times and people who actually question religion, and what your thoughts are on whether or not it's possible to be Māori and utilize Māori belief systems for not necessarily believing in God or the atua as our tupuna did. The example is a Māori atheist they've put there. How whakaro? Pātai nui tira. Pātai nui tira.
Pātai tira.
Yeah.
I guess my perspective and my position is that I'm not religious.
Yeah, tawa.
I see religion as a construct that is non-Māori. I don't understand religion very well, to be fair. I respect it as a perspective of seeing the world, absolutely. But I don't prescribe to some of those ideologies and some of the practices that fall out of that. So I see mātauranga Māori and Atua as non-religious because my Atua are my tupuna. And so it is because I am a part of them and that's a part of me. I don't see it as that's a really tricky pata.
It's a big question.
It's actually a really significant challenge because the perception by Aotearoa is that the karakia practice is about a worshipping of a god.
Aye.
And that comes back to, again, how we define Atua. So when we use words like God, that comes from a worldview and a perspective that is non-Māori. So you would have heard me earlier talk about how Atua are ancestors with continual influence over us, or that they were, I actually really struggle to define it in English.
I think, there's a lot of time there's the whakaaro that there is an equivalent, i roto i te ao tauiwi. And it's not necessarily the case a lot of the times. So I agree with you in that sense, bro. And I guess i roto i te ao Māori hoki, ko ngā mea ka kitea, ka taia te pā wera momo hoki e, ka haere ki te ngahere, ka haere ki te tai ao. Those are the realms, I guess, that we feel safe in and connect to as Māori.
What I would say too, Dario, is that there are some common threads between Māori worldview and religion, and that it's inherent about the belief in a spiritual energy or spiritual perspective that is greater than the self. And so we believe as Māori of Atua who have influence over us and they guide our engagement in particular places. And I think that's why Māori traditionally, our tupuna, my tupuna also, felt really strongly about connections to Christianity and other forms of religion as well. And it's because of the inherent spiritual belief that we had as Māori. So there is some similarities, but I'm not an expert in it actually to have a real formed answer on what that is.
Ka pai. He pata anō e hoa, ko tēnei mea pāna ki te hononga neke e te o ngā hapori. So interested in how you see these insights might be relevant to the current conversation about active travel. So at the moment when talking about moving around our communities by walking, biking, scootering, etc., it seems to be still coming from the colonizers' worldview. Do you have any thoughts on how you can shift these conversations?
One of the things that we need to do as a society is bring nature closer to home.
Right.
When I talked about what is traditional Māori society, there was this inherent relationship between Māori and nature. And that's because nature's laws, I suppose, they guide how you were successful. If you knew how to interpret nature's laws, then you knew how to maximize the benefit for whānau. So that means about how you engaged in the ocean at the right time to get the right ika. So that guided success. And as a result of the world that we're living in now, there is constructs that are founded on white supremacist ideas of what is right and the way that we have created resource out of our atua. So when you're talking about active transport, we're probably thinking about it in how we maintain our power and control over nature. And so we have to consider that in the context of understanding that we are taina to our environments, and how do we enable ourselves to live together in that type of relationship. But the other thing I would add to that too is that the why we travel, the purpose we travel is often to provide for our whānau, go to mahi, they might be in a built-up city, and so our society has created the conditions for us to have to travel like that. If we had the resource and the capacity to define and create our own papakainga that gave us the ability to provide for our whānau, then we could create places and spaces in which we're more aligned to the way that we see the world, and we may not have had need to travel so far to do things. We could stay within our own maunga awa and our own rohe, and only travel in the instance of exchanging my kiriru with the powers on the coast.
Can't wait. Tētahi anō, you kind of answered this in that section, but I just want to acknowledge the pātai as we go through as well. So it was around how can we still promote physical activity for Māori when connection with nature and our motu can be weak. So you sort of talked about bringing nature, you know, closer to us and bringing it a little bit closer to home. I think this is quite closely connected to your whakaaro maybe of ahi tiritiri and ahi mātau bro. So people who are not necessarily feeling the hononga to those spaces. So, you know, he whakaaro anō tau tāna ki tērā?
Yeah, so just repeat the question again.
With increased urbanization, how can we still promote physical activity for Māori when connection with nature and our motu can be weak?
Yeah, ka pai. Yeah, so that framework about the diverse lived realities of Māori recognises that people are on a different stage of the continuum, that there are those that are really well connected and understand mātauranga and practices to those who have zero connection. And so what we have to do as a society and how we apply approaches to physical activity is recognise those diversities, and as a result, we're not going to have one solution that's going to be able to solve that for everyone. Just like in a garden, you have different types of tupu that grow in a garden, and they leverage off each other. And so, as an example, te whare tu taua is an authentic kaupapa Māori mātauranga and form of physical activity can't thrive on its own without other pathways for whānau to be able to engage with that. So how I've talked about how we might apply this is that we need is that each approach for different perspectives and different positions on that continuum needs to be informed by mātauranga Māori. But the interface, the way in which whānau engage with it can be very different. So if we have mātauranga as the common underpinning theory, and then the practice is delivered differently, so you can have a basketball tournament for whānau and include Māori values of whanaungatanga, manaakitanga, and use tikanga in that space to be able to help those whānau who don't understand to learn a little bit more about themselves, to learn a little bit more about tikanga, about mātauranga, and then to plant the seed, I suppose, about how you can engage in physical activity as Māori. And so that is one approach, you know, so that you have mātauranga as the bedrock, but then the things that are built on top of that can look and feel different ways. The other part, I think, in that is that our whānau who do have mātauranga or who do have a deep understanding need to have empathy for our whānau who don't. And I don't support a real elitist type of approach for mātauranga. I think there needs to be a space for rich mātauranga Māori approaches to physical activity. But I need those in those spaces to share their mātauranga with the rest of Aotearoa. Not just Māori, but all of Aotearoa. So that means that our tiriti partners have a role and responsibility to understand what physical activity is for Māori. So we need to be able to bring them along on the journey, and they need to be good partners to be able to share that mātauranga as well.
I'm kind of molding three sort of pātai together, because a lot of the pātai, I'll kōrero to the pātai and probably just maybe kick it off for this one to me. So there's a couple that are saying, why don't we put back into practice the traditional Māori approaches, beliefs and practices, like basing it on nature, stars, Atua concepts. Would love to participate in that. The next one is quite similar about, you know, this person, physical education, health teacher, 2 different bachelors, masters in teaching. We talk so much about how we need to work to uplift our Māori rangatahi, yet we never discuss traditional Māori practices in sport. are there organizations, places, people we as kaiako can turn to guide our practice to align with traditional practice rather than to our Pākehā outlooks and ideas? And then what are some examples of activities that you have applied to yourself? So I thought I'd jump into tuatahi because that's almost the role of Toi Tangata, Whanau. It's one organization in terms of our approach and to physical activity and nutrition from mātauranga Māori perspectives. So this is a good place to start connecting. But like Te Miri said as well, you've got Papatakoro o Aotearoa, you've got Hioranga, Potama, you've got Te Runanga o Te Raroa, places that are doing things. And I think the raru is around the visibility of a lot of these spaces as well, but that's often also linked to the capability and capacity that those rōpū have. So some of these rōpū are really small and they're covering mass amounts of rohe, and other rohe want to get their hands on them as well. So I guess a good starting point would be to continue to connect with Toi Tangata, because that's our role in this space, is to be able to connect in this and provide those opportunities as well. But are there any others that you can think of, Te Miri?
No, that's a really good overview. Māori sport organisations, Māori touch, Māori golf, Māori rugby, there are other institutions that you can draw on. I think locally, different rohe have, like you said, the capability and capacity to do some of that mahi, and it's really dependent on people being in a place at a particular time. There isn't a national strategy for ensuring that we have a really strong workforce, I'd say, a Māori workforce. And again, the question is, well, why is that, and who invests in that? And largely it'll be central government. And so it is again about the valuing of mātauranga Māori and Māori practice. The challenge too is that the often siloed approach to physical activity means that we miss opportunities that sit in other places. Right. So I wouldn't just, particularly when you're thinking about mātauranga, don't just sit in thinking about Māori sports trusts, regional sports trusts, or those who have a mandate in sport, but also think more broadly about whare wānanga, marae, hauora clinics, hapu wānanga, all of those places and spaces are opportunities to learn and share mātauranga. So I think there needs to be a coordinated approach at a national level.
Mā wai tērā, mā toi tangata pia. Ka pai. Well, that leads quite well into this next part. So you're talking about, don't concentrate solely on physical activity, in the different areas. So ko te pātai ki te taha kai. So ke te mohi o ke tātou e hara i te mea ka haeretahi te taha kore, engari me pehe te haeretahi ai te mātauranga o te kore me te mātauranga o te kai. Kia tino whai oranga tō tātou iwi. Nā hira, tērā, kina koe hira. I think that's also another role that Toi Tangata will play in this space. So I guess the difference with our organisation to other spaces is te whakaaro o te whakapapa o ngā kai ki ngā atua me te hononga ki te ao Māori. Ngā hono ngā katoa me ki. So I guess this is, a hub for where you can kickstart a lot of that whakaaro in that space. And although we're not the experts in all areas, there are a lot of mātauranga sitting in this place from a lot of the people who have worked for Toi Tangata, Te Hotu and other spaces over time. So he wahi pai tēnei ki te hono ai. So if you're not already on the database, it'll be a good idea to jump on, because then you'll see opportunities for upskilling yourself and or the rohe that you're in this space. Tētahi anō, bro, hono ai ki tō kōrero pānakia tapu waikura, I think. So grateful for your sharing and research with us. You mentioned healthy active learning as a part of the evolution of physical activity in Aotearoa. Are you able to elaborate on how mātauranga Māori is underpinning this initiative? Ko tapu waikura tērā, ne?
Yeah, tapu waikura. I'll just first respond to the kai question. I think, a lot of the kōrero that I've shared today about mātauranga, Māori beliefs and values, as the underpinning theory, and then physical activity is the expression, is how we apply that. And so the same applies to kai, that there is mātauranga whakapapa of kai, and how we engage in that kai is important for us as Māori. So, and that comes straight through from harvesting to preparation, and then the kai that we actually have. I like the whakaaro that I've heard before around, eating your pepeha. which is basically about, you know, connecting to your own environment and the kai in your area, because it carries the mana and mauri of that place that is required for you in that place. So that's the bit on kai. Love me some kumara. The other bit was tapu waikura. I only have a really surface understanding actually of tapu waikura, and I haven't been involved with that mahi, but I understand that it's really underpinned by Dr. Hirangi Heke's Atua Matua framework, and I'm a strong supporter and advocate of that mahi. He has been a strong mentor, I suppose, for me over the years, for many of us actually. So, you know, mimihi ka tika ki tērā taniwha. What I think is interesting actually about healthy active learning is that it's a co-investment across multiple agencies, Sport New Zealand, Ministry of Education and Ministry of Health. It is education settings, but what is interesting and what I like about that is that it is being informed, or is taking a mātauranga Māori informed approach. So it is, I think it's still in the pilot test trial phase, but the specifics of it I'm really familiar with. When I became aware of it and understood that the Atua Matua framework was underpinning that, I almost didn't need to understand anything else.
Yep.
If there's the underpinning theory, then what falls out of that will be a contribution to traditional physical or modern physical activity for Māori.
Good point. One more part time. So do you think at a senior secondary school level, taonga tākaro should be its own credit? If schools can find teachers that are capable to teach Māori as a language subject, why not locate exponents to teach taonga tākaro alongside kapa, alongside languages?
Yeah, tautoko.
Yeah. I think it's a nice short answer for that one, I think, as well. You know, I think i roto i te ao Māori, that would be the ideal, you know. So, you know, that's the validity that you're sort of talking about, i roto to mātauranga ne. So, in the alignment within the current systems that are in place. So,
again, I think just extending on that one, the fact that we're in a position to ask the question whether or not taonga tākaro should be accredited in secondary schools tells us that the position of power, or what's determined to be allowed to be given credits for, is determined by an institution that is not led by Māori, that doesn't understand or hasn't taken the time to recognise the connection between taonga tākaro and that. So the deeper question actually is about how come Māori are making decisions about their own education.
I think ko tātou tērā, I think. So ko te hihia noi ho te mihi atu kia koutou. Just a couple of things to sort of note that if you're not already on our database, it'd be a really good idea to jump on so you're informed with everything that's sort of coming up. The post communications that will go out after the webinar will be some of the things that Te Miri, contact details and other things that might be of relevance to his kōrero today, some links and other stuff. There will be an opportunity for you guys to feedback a little bit around what other opportunities the workforce or you across Aotearoa are interested in. So make sure you fill that in. And I think usually there's a prize pack up for grabs for the first 10 people go into the draw for a prize pack within Toi Tangata to give you a bit of extra motivation. On top of that, we've got the Hui Atou, Tērā Tau, 17th to the 19th of February, ki kawhia. So if you've never been before, it'd be a good idea to come through, because a lot of the stuff that was discussed today is present within that wānanga space for the Toi Tangata Hui Atou. So e runga i tērā, e mihi atu ana kia koe tuakana. It was awesome to listen to your kōrero, and Whanau, I think you guys should be feeling very privileged because he's only just finished his kaupapa, or almost there, I think, with his kōrero. So he's looking to submit all of the stuff that he's sort of just presented to us. So we're very fortunate to have the opportunity to have Te Miri speak to us all today. I runga i tēnā, ka whakakapia i tētahi pakukarikia katai ka karawhia. Oh, one thing?
That's one thing, from just to close out from me. Yeah, really open to sharing whakaaro with others if there's some things that they want to speak to me more about. But also, I just wanted to recognise harau te tino mātanga ki te ako tonu au, te huhua o ngā tangata E mauna I nei momo mātauranga, and so I'm really keen to learn from others. So if there's some questions or some challenges, I'm really keen to share and sit down with people. So kōrero like that. And the last thing, toi tangata, e tino mihi ana, totally support the mahi that you are doing to progress the narrative about what it means to be Māori in physical activity and nutrition space. And so I'm a strong supporter of your guys' mate. So tēnā koe tā, tēnā koutou katoa.
Ka pai, ka whatakapi e tētai pakakarikia. E te atua koe ne mātou punanga tika ka muimiti ati kia koe ke manaki mai mātou I tēnei wā. Ko puta pai ngā hua o tēnei o ngā wānanga hiko kia toha tohaina I ene o ngā mātauranga kia rātou mā hiakai mo ene momo. I runga I toi ngā tapu me manaki I tia I ngā tangata I tēnei rā kia o rātou nei kainga I te mutunga o nei rā. Aotearoa kia taki nei a mātou noho I raro I ngā kapua pauri, rātou mā ngā whānau pani. I runga I toi ngā tapu, tuturu whakamaua, kia tina, haumi hui e tai ki. Ka pai koutou mā. Thank you very much for attending